Q&A session. And here, I would like to remind the audience to post their questions on the chat feature on the right-hand side and mark them with the question icon. Ms. Safeena Husain, if you are ready, it's my honor to welcome you.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me. It is my honor to deliver today's keynote on how educational disruption due to the pandemic can be turned into an opportunity to rethink education systems worldwide. I have spent the last 12 years working with communities, remote villages for girls' education. And I want to propose today that as we try to rebuild in a way that allows for greater equity, access, inclusion, and innovation, it's important to keep the most vulnerable girls at the center of any new design. Only then can we bring real transformation in the way education systems address the needs of the generations to come. I started Educate Girls in 2007 with the realization that everything that I have achieved is very much because of my education. And since then, we have mobilized communities to question prevailing gender biases against girls and worked in government schools to deliver a child-centric remedial curriculum that helps in improving learning outcomes for all children. In the last 12 years, what I have recognized is that the two Ps, poverty and patriarchy, are the key barriers to girls' education. And now with COVID-19, both of these challenges have become much, much worse. First, the poverty. The economic shock due to job losses and reverse migration has plunged families back into poverty. A recent UN report suggests that nearly 35 million people who had risen out of poverty will be back below extreme line this year alone. And before the end of 2030, 130 million might be living in extreme poverty. So the achievement of the SDGs is under grave threat. Alongside the economic factors, we come to patriarchy. There are crippling communities. There is an emerging regression to all old gendered roles in the households. As families are cooped up, anxieties are high, and children are not in school. We're seeing domestic duties falling straight back onto the shoulders of young girls. We're seeing 17 times increase in domestic abuse cases. India's emergency child helpline received 92,000 SOS calls in just the first 11 days of the lockdown. And distress calls to the National Commission for Women's Helpline doubled. With patriarchy back at play and girls' vulnerabilities shooting back up, school will become a distant memory for so many, and re-enrollment will become near impossible. I wanted to take the example of West Africa after Ebola, where girls' enrollment failed to reach pre-Ebola levels. UNESCO reported that in Liberia, the number of out-of-school girls at primary level tripled from 8% to 21%. Similar to West Africa, where teen pregnancies and child marriage increased, we are seeing more girls being forced to get married. I wanted to share with you a short story that illustrates my point. This is Geeta's story, who was a young girl from a small village in India. When the pandemic hit, Geeta was on the verge of completing her secondary education. With schools closed, distance learning seems kind of impossible for girls like Geeta because they aren't allowed to access the mobile phones because it's thought to be inappropriate. When Geeta took her father's phone to text a girlfriend, her father and brother thought that she was dishonoring her family by talking to a boy. Her brother slapped her, and in anger and despair, she consumed poison and was rushed to a hospital. Geeta was lucky to survive, but she was packed off to live with her husband and in-laws. And as soon as this happened, 3 other girls from the same village met the same fate. Before COVID-19 hit, we were acutely aware of the global learning crisis. And despite huge strides, we had around 130 million girls out of school. With so many countries still in lockdown, we can only estimate the impact that COVID crisis will have. As Geeta's story illustrates, one thing we know for sure is that the crisis has widened inequalities and hit hardest those already struggling, ignored, excluded, or lagging behind. So as we reflect on this and consider the opportunities to build back better, I'm proposing that to tackle the two P's of poverty and patriarchy, we focus on the three R's, which is relief, recovery, and reimagining education systems, all through a gender lens. First, looking at relief. As an education-focused NGO, our priority is always the education of our children. But in these unprecedented times, if we as civil society don't have an immediate response to help alleviate hunger and the risk of deepening poverty, our children will suffer and bear the weight of this crisis. For this reason, at Educate Girls, we pivoted to support the government with food distribution, awareness building, and signposting to social security schemes in some of the poorest and most marginalized villages. And it isn't a surprise that these villages, which are the poorest and most socially excluded, these are the villages with the highest concentration of out-of-school girls. The pandemic has hit the education systems on many levels, and the road to recovery will be long. And we have to accept that all the gains that we have made in enrollment, retention, learning may potentially be undone. So I feel that as the schools prepare to reopen, we have to prioritize enrollment, retention, learning, and address the challenges of nutrition, safety, emotional well-being, and then tackle the inevitable impact on learning. The top on my priority is hunger. And the reason it is hunger is that even in normal times, our women and girls are the last to eat at home, and they eat what is left over. With poverty worsening, they are at highest risk of extreme hunger. To address this, schools need to double down and extend the midday meal programs or take-home rations, possibly extending them to include breakfast wherever budget is. Extra food resources for rural areas where the migrant children are coming back. They've returned to these villages. And tracking and monitoring of this scheme will be incredibly critical. We at Educate Girls have very quickly pivoted, and we have leveraged our existing community and government relationships, the data that we have, and the last mile reach to distribute food to over 100,000 households in just the last 2 months. The second on my list after hunger is safety and access. We need mass awareness on the need for children, particularly young girls, to come back to school when schools reopen. And we have to activate community mobilization to make this sustainable. We have to leverage our communities to really create a demand for girls' education. At Educate Girls, we have created an army of over 14,000 gender champions at the village level to do just that. And in today's time, during the lockdown, we're reaching out to them via WhatsApp, with SMS, phone calls. So we're sort of pivoting to saying, if we can't go face to face, what are the ways in which we can innovate very quickly to activate and keep our gender champions checking on our girls and continuing to mobilize and create a demand for girls' education. Yes, universal access was close to being achieved, but I'm afraid we have to realize that access will become a huge problem again. And for this access to be looked at, we will need an expanded role of our school administrations, our school management committees, engaging more in attendance and increased capacities. We need more room for girls in residential schools and tribal hostels. Maybe even cash transfers to attract and retain girls in school. So we have to think very, very innovatively at whatever we can bring to the table to be able to solve during this crisis. Because girls like Geeta need to be back in school and they need to complete their education. The third piece, emotional well-being. I mean, this is a theme that came out very strongly in the April meeting, and it's a point that I feel I want to reiterate. Children are feeling significant emotional stress and anxiety with the lockdown. Just think of Geeta's situation. Now we need to see psychosocial support initiatives as an absolute priority when schools open. We need to reduce the stress and pressure on children. We can't pressure them to complete the course for the year. We need to help them re-engage with the full school experience and help them overcome the trauma of the pandemic. And finally, to learning. We will have to find a balance between online and offline learning modules or blended learning. Substantial resources will have to go into remedial curriculums, increased investments in bridge camps to support those who have fallen furthest behind or are at risk of dropping out. And now finally, let's talk about reimagining the education system. We need to reimagine an education system that works for all. We know that when we design for those struggling the most, we are fair to everyone and everyone benefits. All means all is how the new GEM report launched just yesterday describes it. When we ran the first ever pilot for a new way of funding education through an impact bond a couple of years ago, we designed a new teaching and learning approach that prioritized children who were lagging furthest behind. We broke down lessons into micro competencies and saw an almost whole additional year of learning achieved in just a few months. We achieved staggering learning gains for so many children as a result of designing for the children starting from the lowest base. Anything we do now to reimagine education has to start from this position. We have to tackle patriarchy and reimagine an education system where textbooks and teaching materials are without gender bias and without the damaging traditional stereotypes. Technology will play a critical role, but school closures are shining a very bright light on the debilitating urban-rural and gender digital divide, which is preventing any form of distance learning from reaching so many of the rural and poor children, and especially girls who need it most. As we see in Geeta's story, even with the phone and internet connectivity in her household, patriarchy still prevented mobile access to so many girls. In conclusion, if there is one corner I'm going to fight, it is, not surprisingly, the corner for girls. And I thank Gordon Brown and Lisbeth Steer, among many others, for their leadership in ensuring that girls are prioritized in Build Back Better strategy. As we reimagine education, we need an intentional gender lens, because gender neutral is actually combined. The World Economic Forum suggested in a recent report that it's going to take 99.5 years for the gender gap to be closed. And we definitely cannot wait that long. I am Safeena Husain, and I educate girls. Thank you.